Hello, boys, hello, girls. Today we're going to be seeing one very simple topic of history, but that is very important that you understand it. It is really important that you are able to tell what are the different durations of history. For example, over here you have a picture of Mr. Fernand Braudel. And Mr. Fernand Braudel was the one who actually explained us this difference about history. So let me pass you this explanation that he originally developed. Okay? So you should remember, boys and girls, that we have studied these two guys, Signoveau and Langlois. And they are the fathers of positivism in history. You don't have to copy this. I will tell you when to start copying. Just start copying the title, which is Durations of History, and I will let you know. We only have 3 or 4 definitions here, so do not worry. This is why you have it in a video, because it is really easy, okay? So do not copy this. Just try to remember this. Signoveau and Langlois were the fathers of positivism in history. What does that mean? That they believed that one could be really objective in when we do history. And what does it mean to be objective while doing history? Well, it means that you're going to detach from the explanation, that your explanation is going to be 100% the facts. But as you remember, we cannot say what were the actual facts, right? But there is a very nice phrase that they developed, that they used to say in order to explain this. They used to say, when you are writing positive history, this is history from the point of view of positivism. If you are writing about the wars between France and Germany, your explanation of said wars should be as objective as that if it doesn't matter if someone from France or someone from Germany would listen or read your explanation, they would both agree. So this would be such an objective, such a factual history that you wouldn't take part of any of these sides. You wouldn't go to follow the facts from the side of France. You wouldn't follow the facts from the side of Germany. No, this would be 100% just the facts. So it doesn't matter if you are talking about these great wars about between two nations. Both nations would agree that those are the facts. That is what positivism is about. And if you remember, we actually read their definition of history. And if you remember, the main problem here is that you require documents. If you don't have documents, then you cannot do history. Why? Well, because according to them, documents are going to give you the official version of history. So those are supposed to be just the facts, right? But of course, that is not the truth. I am just reminding you of these two guys because if you remember, they were the teachers of Marc Bloch, the guy that we are actually going to be using in our studies of history. And they were also the teachers of Lucien Febvre. So I don't know if you remember. If not, I am going to say it again just now. Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre started a magazine in which they started to change all this way in which they used to do history. This idea of actually being factual, of being 100% objective, of actually saying the true facts. They began changing that idea and they began writing a more sociological history. What does that mean? That they started to write history from the point of view of how societies work. Not really about trying to say the actual facts, but trying to explain how societies work throughout history. If you remember, Marc Bloch actually died during World War II. He was killed by the special forces of the Nazis. But Lucien Febvre escaped to New York. And once the war was over, he returned to France and along with Fernand Braudel, he kept publishing that magazine. But Fernand Braudel was like the main figure of those times. He became the most important historian. Lucien Febvre was just like very famous because he was the one that began this movement with Marc Bloch. But actually in these times, Braudel became the most famous historian. And what he's going to be proposing is this idea of the long duration. We're going to see what that is. You still don't have to copy this unless you want to, okay? After they both stopped writing history. There was a third generation. I organized this slide as to tell you the generations of this way of doing history. So first it was Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre with this sociological story, type of story. Then we have Braudel with this idea of the long duration. And we're going to have a third generation that is going to be the history of mentalities by Mr. Jacques Le Goff. We're actually going to be using his ideas when we study Greece. But until that point, do not worry a lot about this. There is actually a fourth generation of this school of history that was represented by Carlo Ginzburg, and his type of history is called microhistory, like taking a very small piece of history and explain it to all its deepness and trying to explain all the phenomena that are happening in that very small part of history, like how this very small piece of history can talk me about very big processes. And actually he wrote this very nice book. If you can read it, I recommend it a lot. Like, you can understand a lot about history just by reading the introduction of this book, and if you read the whole book you will be an expert historian. It is a really good book. It is called The Cheese and the Worms, and it is about some troubles that a man had during the 16th century, because he started having very weird ideas about the Bible and about the Quran. So he actually got into a lot of trouble with the church. So Mr. Ginzburg found this case, and he started to explain how this case is able to talk about the whole processes that were happening during this time. But not everybody admits that Ginzburg would be the fourth generation of this school of history. Usually, people usually only accept 3 generations. But if there is a fourth generation, if one may think of a fourth generation, that would be Carlo Ginzburg. If you remember, this is the second generation, right? The second generation is the one that is going to explain us the durations. So you should start copying in your notebook just in this moment. Now you have to copy. Fernand Braudel is going to tell us that there are 3 durations in history: the short duration, the middle duration, and the longue durée. La longue durée. It is basically the long duration, but many times you will read and hear this term in French. So it would be la longue durée. And you need to understand that all these durations of history are within the problem history scale of history, right? Even if we're going to see that the short duration, for example, over here, is going to happen in the lifespan of people, for example, one person. So this may be very similar to a biography. It is not the same as a biography. All these 3 scales happen within the global history, within problem history. Why? Because it doesn't matter if we are looking at processes in a very short duration. We are trying to explain something. We are researching something. So remember that every time that you are trying to give an actual explanation, that is going to be problem history. So do not get confused. Not because we may speak about the lifespan, so this is just the amount of time that 1 or 2 generations of men may live. It doesn't mean that we are talking about biography. This is still problem history. Remember that we are going to work with problem history the whole year, but we may talk about problem history in 3 different durations of time: the short, the middle, and the long durée. What are these durations? Also write this, please. The short duration is about all the processes that happen in the lifespan of men. You can also find that the short duration is the time of men. Why? Because in here we're going to be observing the processes that we can actually see in short periods of time. In the lifespan is, that word means the time that men are expected to live. So for example, Nowadays, men are expected to live like 75 years, more or less, right? So that is the lifespan of men. Very short time. So the short duration are all these processes that we're going to be able to see like in 30 years, no more than 70 years, right? And it is very short duration. Um, because this is like the smallest time that we can study and that we'll be able to talk about processes. We're going to see a bit more about that in just a few moments. Then we have the middle duration. The middle duration is about the transformation of social structures. So this usually happens within a century. Just remember that the century is not 100 years, not when you are talking in history as a science. If you're talking with your friends and with your family, of course, if you say 1 century, everybody's going to understand 100 years. But if you are talking to a historian, the century is not going to last 100 years. We are going to say more about this, but we have already spoken about this in previous classes. And finally, la longue durée, the long duration. This is about studying the processes. Sorry, in here I am missing an S. Let's include it because we shouldn't have these mistakes, right? Uh, this is about the processes of very slow change, processes that take a lot of time, at least several centuries, right? At least, uh, for example, 3 centuries, 5 centuries. That is going to be long duration. And that is why, and we're going to understand this very, very well in just a few moments, it may also be understood as the geological history. Now, do not get confused. This is not about taking Earth as the measurement of history. Remember that in history we require humanity. History is about studying humanity. But we can study humanity in the frame of geological changes, and we're about to understand that a lot better. But these are basically the definitions of these 3 durations. The short duration are all those processes that we can explain within the lifespan of one person at most 2 people. The middle duration are the transformation of social structures that usually happen within the century. Actually, that's the definition of century. And la longue durée, that is about the processes of very slow change, the ones that take several centuries and that may be thought of in the frame of geological time. Okay? So, examples and better explanation. Short duration, again, are the processes that happen in the lifespan of men. For example, over here you have Napoleon, right? And if you study the life of Napoleon, perhaps not his first years, if you study his adult life, you're going to be able to observe a lot of processes, a lot of changes in France mainly. You're going to see the end of monarchy with the French Revolution, and you're going to have Napoleon becoming the emperor. He's going to fight basically against all Europe, like he is actually going to fight against all Europe. He's going to conquer a lot of territories. But once he is defeated in the Battle of Waterloo, basically France stops being one of the main powers of Europe. And this is going to continue throughout the rest of history. France and England were the most important countries during the Middle Ages. But once you reach this point, after the defeat of Napoleon, this is going to stop. Perhaps France is going to win more power with the nephew of Napoleon, with Napoleon III. Actually, Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon, was the one who appointed Maximilian as the Emperor of Mexico. But that is just like a small exception. In general, France is going to lose this very important place in Europe, starting with the defeat of Napoleon. So you can study all these processes just if you pay attention to the adult life of Napoleon, right? So that is very short duration. I can make an explanation. I can study social processes in a very short period of time. These transformations took like 30 years. 30 years. It is very, very fast, right? Then we have the middle duration, the transformation of social structures, the century. Perhaps this is going to be the most interesting one. Why? Because of this idea of the century. The center is the unit of analysis of history, and we're going to repeat this in the second half of the second trimester because we're going to start studying centuries for everything, okay? So, what is a unit of analysis? A unit of analysis is the smallest thing that you can get and that still tells you something about what you are researching, that is still able to tell you something about what you are studying. Here you have some examples. For example, in biology. As biology studies life, the smallest thing that biology can study that is still able to tell something, to say something about life, is the cell. So the cell would be this unit of analysis for biology, for classic biology. Then we have something called molecular biology, and they are going to have smaller units of analysis like DNA or proteins, amino acids. They are going to go smaller. But for classic biology that study life, the smallest unit of life is the cell. So that is the unit of analysis. In geography, the unit of analysis is the region. Why? Because something smaller is not able to tell you really something. Something smaller than the region is a place. And we're going to have some discussions about this in the second trimester. Perhaps do not worry too much about this now, because it may be a bit complex to understand why a place is not able to tell you a lot of things. But just remember, a place is something that has a social or personal meaning. So if I can say that this is a place for me, but it is a no place for someone else, well, then what can I say about it? Like, we don't even agree if it is a place. But if we have a collection of places joined by common criteria, then we can talk about that, right? That can teach us something. And it can teach us about those common criteria. For example, it can talk about climate, it can talk about economy, it can talk about culture, right? So that is the smallest thing that we can get that is still able to tell us something. In anthropology, for example, and mainly in one branch of anthropology, it is family. For example, in this type of notation, triangles mean men and circles mean women. So in here we have a couple, they are married, and they have a boy as a son, and this is the sister of the mother. This is a very important institution, but do not worry, because this is one of the most complex things in anthropology, the relation with the brother of the mother. It is quite complex, but the main idea here is that this is a family. So remember that I have already told you, social sciences do not study the individual. The smallest thing that we can study are families. Yes, so that would be the unit of analysis. And in history, that is the century. Why? Because if I go smaller than the century, that is not really going to be able to talk about the social transformations. There are some processes, as we saw in the short duration, that can happen in the lifespan of men. But real social transformations are going to take a century. Each century has a different duration precisely because of that. Because the idea of time itself is about change. So change means process, right? Going from one state to another. And the span in which societies go from one state to another is around the century, but it is not exactly 100 years. So for me, always the best example is the 20th century, right? Here you have a map of how was the distribution of power before the First World War. So you can see that all this pink part is the Russian Empire, we have the Chinese Empire, in yellow we have the British Empire, that also includes Canada. And in the 20th century, we're going to basically be seeing how the United States is going to be turning Latin America into their own empire. But that is until the 20th century, by the first and second halves. But this was the world in World War One, and after World War One was over, we had the Cold War. We had a lot of other problems and transformations, and by the end of this century, we are not even looking at nations anymore. Nations are not the main focus in the world. It is money, right? Because it is the time in which capitalism defeats communism. The world basically becomes capitalist, and capitalism is going to go beyond countries. Like, look at the companies nowadays. Companies nowadays are bigger than countries. You have a company that has that has presence in Europe, that is also in Asia, that is in America, and they are making money out of every single place, and it doesn't matter the nation, it doesn't matter the country. Capitalism goes beyond the country. So this is going to be a huge transformation from this time of great empires to this time of great capitals, right? And that will happen in like 74, 76 years. So that is the 20th century, basically, going from this state, as it says here, going from one state to another. The 20th century is going from this state to this other state, and that took like 74, 76 years, and that was the century. So the century is going to last as long as much as the transformations take to happen, and the middle duration, as it is about the transformation of social structures, well, that happens within the century. Sometimes we can go a bit longer than the century, but usually the century is going to be the measurement of the middle duration, okay? Precisely because of this, because social structures change within the century. Sometimes you will see some middle duration studies that are going to comprise 2 centuries, but no more than 2 centuries. 3 centuries, 4 centuries, 5 centuries is already longue durée, okay? So finally, longue durée. In order to understand really good the longue durée, this is the best book, written by Braudel, right? The one that is actually explaining us all these things about the duration. He wrote this book. But we can go a bit back. We can take a few steps back. Because in here, in the Royal Touch, if you remember this example that Marc Bloch was researching, in which people in France and England would believe that that kings were able to heal people just by touching them. Actually, this phenomenon took place from the 11th to the 16th or 17th century. So those are 5 or 6 centuries, right? So this is very long duration. Even if he's researching this very particular situation in which people may think that they can be healed by kings just by the royal touch, this process took like 5 or 6 centuries. So this book is very long duration. So what we are going to read a lot in books, sorry for that, what one usually reads in books is that this idea of the long duration that Fernand Braudel is giving us actually was started by Marc Bloch. He isn't calling it long duration, but he's presenting his studies within the long duration. At least that's the opinion of Le Goff. If you read Le Goff is going to tell you the long duration of Fernand Braudel was already present in the studies of Marc Bloch. But this is very logical, right? Because they belong to a same way of making history, the way that we are using for this course. So it is very logical that they all think pretty much alike. But the best example is this one, the Mediterranean. Why? Because Braudel actually took 20 years in writing this book. And what he's writing is how the geological, the climatic, the natural conditions of the Mediterranean are going to be great limits, and there are going to be great conditions to how societies work. All the societies, the European societies that revolve around the Mediterranean Sea, they are going to have the Mediterranean as a limit. So as long as the Mediterranean keeps working in the same way, as long as the climate of the Mediterranean stays the same, these societies are working the same way. So it is a really long process, because even if you can see a lot of middle duration changes within those societies, if you can see that you have a lot of transformations of social structures there, what he's going to be saying is yes, but there are things that didn't change until the center of the world was the Atlantic Ocean with the discovery of America. Until that point, Europe only worked within the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean was the geological frame of all the life of these societies. So we can study these societies if we study this very long duration time of the geological conditions that exist in the Mediterranean Sea. So this is a very interesting idea, and this is actually the best explanation of longue durée. That is why it says here geological history. It is not about making the history of the Mediterranean Sea as a sea. No, it is the idea here is using the Mediterranean Sea as the frame to observe societies, because societies are living in a certain climate. When they live in the Mediterranean Sea, they have access to certain resources when they live in the Mediterranean Sea. They are limited to some interactions when they live in the Mediterranean Sea. So all of these things are going to remain more or less the same as long as the limit of their world is the Mediterranean. So that is why this is very long duration, because if the Mediterranean Sea doesn't change, there are a lot of things that are also not going to change in societies. And these things actually did not change until the discovery of America, in which the center of Europe is no longer the Mediterranean Sea, but the Atlantic Ocean, because in the Atlantic Ocean they are going to have access to all the resources of America, right? But until that time, the Mediterranean Sea was the center of Europe. And if the Mediterranean has some geological, climatic, natural conditions, then those societies are going to remain more or less the same. So we're going to have these very long processes that we are going to be able to see from Rome or from the Greek people even, all the way to the 16th century. So those are 20 centuries. If 20 centuries, so that is 2,000 years, is not long duration, then nothing is long duration, right? And even before, it can be like 30 centuries. 3,000 years very well may be thought of as the history of the Mediterranean. So those are all the durations of history, boys and girls. Just remember that there are these three durations: the short duration, the middle duration, and the long durée, and that is the difference. One is about the lifespan of one person or perhaps two generations. The other one is the duration of the transformation of social structures, so that's basically the century. Just remember that the century is not 100 years. And finally, the longue durée, which are these very, very slow processes that are going to take a lot of time, and that we may very well frame them in the geological history. It is not about geology, it is about societies, but societies framed in the geological time, so very slow changes, right? And I just want to tell you, girls and boys, that next year, when you're in second grade, you are going to study these durations. I have seen these durations in the second grade book, but they never tell you that the guy who actually developed these ideas was Fernand Braudel. And where does these ideas come from? And they come from this way of doing history that is a very French way of doing history. But that is all, girls and boys. So this was a very simple topic, durations of history, right? So thank you very much and bye.